Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Rob.
Ray, can I jump in ahead of the minutes and just
Sure.
my friend Sarah. So Sarah's joining us on the call today. She's a data scientist working in DC right now, and she and I go way back in like 2008 grad school days, and she wanted to check on what we're up to and maybe find some time to help.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, welcome.
Hi, Sarah.
So we're just going to run through our agenda, Sarah, but I'm happy to loop back with you afterwards if you have any questions and just chat a little bit.
Cool. Sounds good.
So, Pat, can you not add the Google Doc? It should be open to anyone with a link.
It's not, but we can figure it out after. I mean, or when.
Okay. Yeah, I just threw it in
I,
there.
sorry, I can see the agenda. It's just the link to the README template one is saying that I don't have access.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I also don't have access to that.
All right. You should have access now. Sorry about that. It was sort of... So just quickly, I wanted to we submitted the Doris Duke grant, and so I think we hear from them sometime in May. And also we're organizing the hiring committee, and so people who have noted interest have been on the analyst side has been Jake and Marcy. Lourdes as well said that she could do it because we wanted someone outside of web monitoring to be part of that. And then, you know, I realize interviewing is a very time-intensive process. So, you know, if you wanted to be in the committee, any you know, Kevin, Rob, or Dan, you know, you're definitely welcome to be part of that too. But we were also thinking of having more of like a secondary group for the interviewing so that you wouldn't have to necessarily do a lot of the preliminary groundwork and then you just sifting through resumes and then maybe doing a screen call. And then when we actually sort of filter through that, that's when I think your time is most valuable for, you know, the group chat interviews. But if you wanted to be involved earlier, I mean, that's, you know, I'm certainly happy to have your time, but I just wanted to give everyone options on the way it worked or could possibly work. Does that make sense? So yeah, so if you do want to be involved in the more of the earlier conversations, just let me know. We can add you to that too. Okay. And then we still have the draft of the job description. That's only for the software developer. I haven't gotten any comments yet on it. It won't go live for a little while, so if you still want to take a look at it and add comments, there's definitely time. And the next thing on my plate is to start drafting the project lead job description. And then we have recorded walkthroughs. We can save that for a little bit of time. I've also been in contact with Climate Central, getting an extension on the Climate Central fund, that additional $15,000. It shouldn't be a problem, but I haven't heard back from them yet, so I just need to circle back to make sure that that's not going to be a big deal. And hopefully we'll just continue to maybe apply that to some Virginista costs, and then whatever is left, we can also potentially add that to the dev or the project lead hire that we're implementing. PatCon. So Pat, why don't you just add it to the developer update list and just add your name? Okay. So Tolly is running late for the analyst update, but he can give it perhaps a little later. And then we don't have to necessarily go in order, but I did work on a README template with Kevin yesterday, and that was just sort of taking a bunch of some of the links that PatCon shared and just sort of looked at what our repos have and sort of started working on what potentially a sort of baseline template could be. And definitely please leave comments or edit that as well. But I know Rob mentioned that the main web monitoring repo needs a lot of work too. And so that the content in that will be slightly different than I think what the other main repos would be. So there's definitely discussion to be had on what that would go. And so this template doesn't necessarily reflect what would go into the main repo, the main web monitoring repo. And then something else I just wanted to point out is I did a quick sketch in Zeppelin. This is just the public link, but if you want to do annotations, I can invite you to the project, and then you'll have to create a login, but then you could annotate that. And this was just after talking to Kevin about, I can probably share my screen for this. I don't think this could potentially be a much larger conversation, but Kevin and I were talking about the way everything sort of all the repos work together, which was one of the things that Rob mentioned isn't really explained that well in the main web monitoring repo. So I thought, getting to maybe a system diagram would actually be helpful too. If we end up just using it, even just so that we as a group understand what's happening. And so you have like where the data's come and the different repos, also where data is being housed, and then UI interfaces. And I've tried to map out some flows of how things are working. I'm sure there are mistakes here or things aren't clear. So I'm definitely looking forward to getting input on that and iterating on that as well. So that is up, and I'll send out invites to Zeppelin, and then maybe we can comment on it. I don't know if we necessarily need to spend time today, but if there is time to talk about it, I'm happy to loop back to it, or if anyone had any quick questions about it now, we can chat for a minute or two on it. I've been sort of talking a lot quickly.
Just to clarify, you're looking for comments within their commenting system? That's the best venue for that?
We can try that. It's basically, you can annotate things like a wireframe, basically. I mean, I'm using Sketch and Zeppelin, and so these are wireframing tools, but if it's easier for you just to like write stuff out in longer form text, because that's not really suited for annotations, we can try it through just in Slack or email or something like that. What's sort of nice about the annotations are you can put them to the place of where you're talking about in the image.
Yeah.
But if it's like if there's like a lot of text that you want to share, annotations might not be the best way to do it.
Okay.
But sorry, Rob, were you going to say something?
Do you want any comments on the accuracy of it right now? Or would you rather do that separately?
Why don't we save it to the end, and then because I know there's a lot of other things like to discuss in the half hour.
Sounds good.
You're muted, Ray.
Sorry. So that's what I've been up to. Why don't we move into developer updates, and then we can circle back to any longer discussions that we need to.
I can start first because that's very quick. So yeah, I worked with Ray on some doc stuff. Pushed the branch that we're going to be working on together just to fix things up. And then Rob reviewed a PR for me with really good stuff. So I'm going to have to work on that later today. I had a quick question, Rob, just for clarification. In it, you mentioned that we might or try to use a different, to not use recursion, and instead it seemed like you suggested resolving one of the version methods with that as an object with the next method. Is that what you were saying as an alternative to using recursion?
No, it was not. What I was saying, yes, I guess so. Instead of resolving it to an array, resolve it to an array with a method called next and maybe previous that gets you the next or previous chunk. That's an alternative approach.
Yeah.
So you deal with something that's kind of like an iterable.
Okay. I'll look into that. But yeah, I understood all the other comments and they make a lot of sense. So thanks. I it's hard for me to see the larger architecture, so you're always good at plugging up all the tiny holes that I don't see. So thanks.
Okay. I mean the recursive approach is fine too. It's just nice to have something that you can step through. That way you can use the same method to ask for 100 things or 1,000 things. Or if you run out of memory, you can stop. Those are the nice things about async iterables or streams or observables or that whole family of things that are not just single objects that contain a list.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks. I'm done.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. Rob, did you want to give an update, or could you give an update?
There's PRs for all of the possible approaches to the skip pages or don't skip pages or whatever issue. So whatever people want to do. And any or all of them need review.
All right.
I started reviewing that, Rob, and I've got a tab open and question, but I'll punt it to the end also.
Okay. Dan, do you want to give an Ansible update?
Sure. So where we last left our heroes, we had a mostly working Kubernetes-based deployment tool and a not even halfway working Ansible-based deployment tool. And we said that today we would pick one of those that we were going to commit to, or just decide that neither was going to be ready in time and that we would manually deploy everything, with the goal being moving from the Heroku production deployment that is the Rob is personally paying for onto the AWS resources that we have actual funding for. And so I was able to find some time amidst juggling baby spit to work on the Ansible one. And I think it's the winner. I'm excited about the Kubernetes one still. I think in the scenario where it's running, it's much easier to manage. But in the scenario where it breaks, I guess the old argument that I've explained a couple times, that Ansible is easier to sort of just dive in and directly touch stuff, is compelling. I now have an Ansible deployment that has the UI, the DB, and the differ, and they're all talking to each other, and they're all happy. I'm not particularly pleased with how clean it is, and I could definitely do some refactoring, but it's at the point now where there are no hard problems left that would make me worry that I couldn't figure them out quickly or something like that. So I would say the Ansible deployment is about as mature as the Kubernetes one is. Still have to add logging, wouldn't be ready to deploy production tonight or something, but we could schedule at this point like a training. We could talk about moving staging from Kubernetes to Ansible, in the next week or so, if that makes sense. In the minutes, I put a link. If you have a staging account, you should be able to see that link. I'll just drop it for your convenience in the Zoom chat as well. That should do it. So that's an example that if you look at a given diff, you can see the UI is working, the Rails app API is working, and the differ is responding to requests.
That's great. We also have a conversation with Francis scheduled.
Right. So what we're looking for from Francis is some opinions about how to interact with AWS network topology. I think I have a pretty clear idea of how this is supposed to work now, but I'd be super interested in feedback from more experienced people using P1. So.
Right. We also had an offer from Owens and AI to do some of their DevOps stuff to take a look at it too. So
Who is that?
Owen.
Okay.
But we'll start with Francis because I think he's a little more accessible, and then we can see if we need if we want more advice too.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Sorry, Rob?
Does it not work over HTTPS, or is there something weird about my connection?
It did earlier work over HTTPS.
It's not working for me, and
Yeah, you're right. It's not working.
okay.
It's not great. Well, anyway, it was working earlier today.
Well, I think we had the bigger issues with it figured out already with DB when we were working together the other day, so
Yeah.
should be straightforward.
At this point, I would say whatever's left to make this thing work is easier than deploying by hand. And that's all we really need to know, right?
Sure.
I also have the import worker up, I think, but there's a question for you in Slack.
Okay.
So that's it for me.
Great. Rob, I just had PatCon, why don't you give a quick demo, and then Rob, I had a quick question about the bulk import script from AI or IA.
Sure. It doesn't need to. I can demo if, but I could also just say I could ask whether people saw the message that was dropped into Slack and understood the context of it, or would anyone? I feel like I should. Okay, so basically, there is now. This has been on the docket for a while, but now the Trello onboarding and any future versions of it, there's actually, when you're setting it up, any admin can kind of go in. So there's now a little copy board button in the corner that replaces the very first step of the Trello onboarding, where someone kind of manually went into deep menus and copied. But the administrators can add a Slack hook URL. So now whenever someone initiates, they click that button, they authorize, they kind of go through a little wizard of authorizing a Trello account, and then it does all the it creates a new Trello for a new board for the personal account. It sets it to public so others can see it. It gets all the details and then drops a link to that onboarding into a Slack channel of our choice. So I have it right now. It doesn't need to, but right now it's going into web monitoring. And so whenever someone comes in and starts the developer onboarding, we can kind of immediately, no one can almost look over their shoulder or for assistance or just know where they are. And I don't know if that will I know sometimes the onboarding was a little neglected before, and I wonder if this touch point of knowing whenever it's being used might help it kind of stay both up to date and and also help us see kind of maybe where people are falling off, because we can actually see, oh, if someone makes it through 3 steps, they never come and talk to us. They stopped, they stopped the onboarding at like step whatever. So I'm curious whether whether that seems helpful. I know in the ideal world, asking that first is best, but like I felt pretty good about like this could be a good thing and hoping. Yeah, sorry, go for it, Kev.
I like that general idea of the like we're aware that somebody's being onboarded. My only concern is that onboarding Trello board itself, is it like sufficient, or I don't know. We haven't gone through that itself, so I don't know if that process itself is beneficial. Like I would like to like review that process first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I think it's been on the main README for a while. So I think whether it was out of date or not, maybe no one was going through it, but it's pretty prominently displayed. I imagine some people were going through and maybe just not speaking.
Yeah.
So hopefully it's evident whether it's used or not.
Yeah, I will take some of the responsibility. I should go through it myself and review it. I'm just saying, like, I like the idea of being notified, but I want to make sure that what they're going through is actually like, the right stuff to go through.
Yeah. So does anyone have any thoughts on whether should that be decommissioned or? I think my connection's bad.
We're not maintaining it now.
What was that, Ray?
That was Rob.
Well, I don't know, maybe we lost Pat, but I guess what I was just going to say is that we're not really maintaining it now, and we're not even doing a good job maintaining the READMEs, as evidenced by all this other conversation. So, I mean, we don't have enough people or time to do too many things. So I worry that another thing for onboarding, rather than just having some information in the README, is going to be another place that we fail to keep up to date. And that is anti-helpful to people because it's telling them the wrong thing because it's old or whatever. Like, that's my worry about it. I like the idea of like knowing that somebody's trying stuff out, but I don't know. It also seems questionable to me, like how often somebody will necessarily use that rather than just try and follow the READMEs. And if somebody uses it, whether they'll check all the right things that allow us to actually see what's going on, or if they're just going to read through it and do the things, in which case it's not telling us anything about how far they got through it either. And it's just like another thing. Anyway, I like the idea, I like the intent. I just worry that like it's not actually going to achieve the things we want.
So just for feedback, thanks, Rob. I totally respect that. When we were doing hack nights and doing edgy stuff, like I actually, when that was built, I would purposely, I would avoid, because when I was busy with other things, I wouldn't have time to onboard people into Data Together, which was supposedly what I think I would have preferred to do at that time, just because it was like more my responsibility, and I would point people towards that, and people in person like had lots of feedback. There was lots of positive feedback in person from new people, and people were like asking for more checkboxes and essentially saying like that they felt really up to speed, like they kind of were off on their own for an hour and felt totally guided. And I've never gotten that feedback on like even a manual README. So I did hear really positive things in person, just to like pass that on, even like before.
Was that for web monitoring or for some other project?
No, it was for web monitoring. This would have been like.
Was it especially helpful because there was like an in-person event, and so it let people be sort of self-guided, but they were in a room with other edgy people? Was that the context?
Yeah, they weren't really they were in a room with other edgy people, and there was, I think, Conrad, who was on a few calls at the time, was kind of there beside the person, but they were kind of they were their own. I'm sure there was some support, but like it definitely was pretty self-guided and heard really good feedback in person from that experience.
I guess maybe.
So I don't feel job question, I think, but I'd be curious to hear more of like newcomers.
Go ahead, Rob.
I was just going to say that's really great to hear and surprising because we've never gotten PRs from somebody who appears to have gone through it because the things they do not reflect that checklist. Which is why my assumption was that people aren't really using it. But if they are and it's helpful, then that's a useful thing to know.
Yeah, I agree. I think part of it is the people at the events might be slightly different population than the people who discover our repos in another way, because they might be more used to working on something more independent. But it also is interesting that it was at an event where there were people there. So it might be something where, we're onboarding people a little more like it might be that people are doing this, but it's still guided by anyone, me, or other team members as they sort of onboard too. So this is like, it's like there might be a checklist, but it's also scaffold with people. And that's probably maybe the optimal mix of it. Because I do know, like in those kinds of events too, it's easy to feel lost where you don't know where to do anything. It just feels like you're moving towards something. But I have some other questions just about on how do you monitor the people's progress, PetCon, but we can take that offline.
And would it be fair to like maybe a month of just leaving? Like, is it okay to let it be in chat and exist for a month and see what sort of? I feel like knowing when people visit and use it is like a step to give us data about like whether it was used instead of just guts. Is it okay to leave it on for a month and see how that goes?
I don't have a problem. Yeah. Cool. So the other
and second thing was just adding technologies used section to like the main thing so people can see whether their skills apply. And if folks want to jump into there and just try to catch, I'm not sure all the technologies used, so feel free to just leave a quick comment in the README.
Yeah, you can look on the job description also.
Right. Just quickly, Rob, with the bulk import, what exactly was imported? I know you did URLs from the important changes, but is there other?
I did all the URLs in the actively working sheet, which is what is powering reports and things.
Right.
But that was like 2 or 3 weeks ago now, and I think that sheet has probably changed significantly.
Okay. Because I was sort of toying around with, because I wanted to show some of the analysts are curious in what it would look like if there were a ton of them. And I did find a bunch of links that were clearly scraped, or included Internet Archive data too. But I'll refer back to the working sheets. That's helpful. So, we're at 2:30. I wouldn't mind a couple of minutes, Rob, to talk about the sketch and things that need to get changed or corrected, if you have a few minutes. Or is it a much longer conversation?
No, I have a few minutes.
Might be nice. I don't know how much more time you have, Sarah, but going over the diagram of how all these pieces fit together might be a nice onboarding conversation.
Yes.
Fly on the wall for.
All right.
Um,
Yeah, I can stick around.
Okay.
Cool. Ray, do you want to share your screen so we can look at that diagram again? And is it possible to zoom in so we can read stuff? Is it easy for you to make edits as we go, Ray? Or not really? I can't hear you.
You're muted, Ray, I think.
I could open up the raw file, but it might be easier just to talk it through, and then I can go back and try to make changes.
Okay.
And it's recorded too, so I can go back and I'll look at the video in case there are any questions.
Okay. I'm going to back a little bit up to give Sarah some context, maybe a little bit more than we would say now, if I can start there. We need to get raw, saved snapshots of HTML pages at various times, such as before January 19th, 2017. And originally we used a paid service that lets you set up a list of URLs to be scraped at regular intervals called Versionista. And we're trying to generalize so that we can ingest snapshots from any service, especially the Internet Archive, because that's a free place that you can get snapshots of URLs, and they let you download the whole history of timestamped HTML pages of various URLs. But then potentially other scrapers, including some that we might run internally to target specific websites, especially EPA.gov, and get better coverage than the Internet Archive has. So what the left of this diagram is trying to show is that we have multiple sources of snapshots, or we call them versions, which are basically a timestamp and an HTML page. Ray, I would just delete Page Freezer because we cannot access that data right now, and it just makes things confusing, I guess.
Sure.
Yes, I would agree.
So we have basically a cron job running that hits Versionista at regular intervals and downloads all the snapshots that we haven't seen yet, all the new snapshots. That's what the Versionista scraper is. Ray, I would add, I don't know, IA importer, I guess, which happens to be part of the web monitoring processing library, but there's some symmetry. There should be some, the way that Internet Archive flows in and the way the Versionista flows in should I think look more symmetric than they do here.
Yeah, it's a little bit, sorry, I didn't realize I had my sound on. There's some guy with a saw outside my window, so it's great. There's a little bit of a thing that's confusing about web monitoring processing, because all the other projects basically represent a process or service that runs, and web monitoring processing is kind of a whole grab bag of several different things. There's at least 3 different processes in there, plus a library of other tools. So there's an importing script, but there's none of the configuration for running it. There's a service for doing there's a whole bunch of tools for creating diffs between web pages using different algorithms and getting different sorts of output, not just like using different algorithms for the same kind of output. We have that too. So it's like different algorithms for doing the diff and different ways of outputting the diff. So generating like a visible HTML page versus like diffing source code, and generating JSON output versus whatever. Versus just lines or whatever. And then there's a server, there's a HTTP server in there that serves up those algorithms by a request response cycle. So you can give it to URLs to diff, and it will give you back the diff of those URLs according to the algorithm and the options you specified. So those are all really different things that happen to live in that repo. So it might be, to Dan's point, more clear to separate out. There is a process that happens to have its code living in that repo that pulls stuff from the Internet Archive the same way Versionista pulls stuff from Versionista. and that is very different and separate from the other main thing in web monitoring processing, which is the diffing server, which connects to all the different stuff in our infrastructure in a different way.
Would it be helpful then to have multiple web monitoring processing items here, and maybe either call them out by function like diffing services, or even maybe like the module name?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. You could even consider color coding by repo, because there's not that many repos. And there's another piece where the web monitoring DB has two processes in it, right? It has the Rails server that handles all these API requests and is kind of the heart of the whole thing. And then there's also a worker process that handles batched import jobs from either Versionista or IA. So that's another case where, either put in the bottom of the box the repo, or color code by repo or something, and then just either invent a name or use the module name or whatever makes sense to you.
Yeah, and as a minor point, that worker is theoretically invisible to the outside world. It's kind of an implementation detail of web monitoring DB, but it is a big and important one. So, but no other service or piece of the infrastructure should ever see it or talk to it. The other major thing I would say here is that Versionista Scraper does not talk to the Google Sheets, and it does not talk to the database. It does put things in S3, which is a very different thing in place from the database, so I would call that out separately. And then it talks to Web Monitoring DB as a service, the exact same way that the importing tools in web monitoring processing do.
Right.
I see. So the DB, that's the worker stuff I guess you're talking about, where it's calling the Versionista scraper.
It's the other way around. Web Monitoring DB just sort of sits there and is dumb, and other tools like the Versionista scraper and the Internet Archive scraper, I'll just call that for symmetry's sake, so it's clear, the part that lives in web monitoring processing but scrapes Internet Archive, both of them will just run on a schedule on their own. Nothing else tells them what to do. They sit there on a server and they run on a schedule, and they compose a package of data to send to Web Monitoring DB, and Web Monitoring DB has an endpoint that is the imports endpoint, where you can post an import and say, I have all this data that I would like you to add to your database. And Web Monitoring DB will then log that, and then it'll kick off the worker to actually do that work, because that potentially takes a long time. So you don't want to do it directly in response to a HTTP request.
Right.
Okay. And then another quick question I had is, hey, Toli, you're looking spiffy today.
Thanks, Mike.
Wait, can we fill out one more piece of that before we go to the next step, Rob? Just thinking. So Rob mentioned splitting out the database from S3. Is it clear that when the scrapers, whether it's a Versionista scraper or the Internet Archive scraper, runs on its schedule, and posts to the DB this long-running import job, that the effect of that import job is to download a copy of the content in S3 buckets that we manage, so that we definitely have a copy of this data, and to create entries in the database. So the database says, we have a new snapshot, a new version at such and such time, and the content was stored by us in such and such S3 location. That's in the database. And then in the S3 location, we have the actual content. So both things get saved as a result of any import job from Versionista or Internet Archive. But they're totally separate stores. The database with the metadata, you could say, and the S3 with the actual scraped content of the web page.
Yeah, I think the important thing about them being separate stores is that one of them is public and other things access it, and one of them is not, and that's the database. It is nothing else outside of Web Monitoring DB ever sees or touches or does anything with the database. Web Monitoring DB is the it's the access gate to the database that says who can do what and puts it in an ordered form of an API.
Okay. And there's several databases, right? There's like a Redis database and a Progress database.
The Postgres database is the one we've been talking about so far. The
Okay.
Redis database is used internally by that import worker process. So when the scraper posts to the DB, it says import this long list of things, then that job gets put on a Redis queue and a worker consumes the job and does it. That's all internal.
We have 2 Redis instances. One of them is just a cache. The other one is just manages jobs. So basically all it does is say, I stored the fact that you scheduled a job to run ASAP in this queue, which is what Dan was talking about.
Right. The Redis cache is for cached diffs, Rob. I haven't even looked at that because that happened while I was out, I think.
It's for cached anything, but the only thing that we cache right now is diffs because caching API queries is complicated and hard.
Got it. Right. So when you say that the database, the Postgres database, is private because the public access to that is via the web monitoring DB or the Rails app API, and S3 is public. The reason that the S3 is public is that when an analyst pulls up a copy of a saved web page in their browser, they get that from the S3. Their browser has to be able to download the content from our S3. That's why it's public.
Yes. And we've talked before about potentially putting that behind web monitoring DB. So you always make a request through it, whether it's for the raw content or the diff, because you go through it for the diff right now. But we haven't actually done that. So that bucket is a public place for UI or anybody who's doing anything that needs access to the raw content to use. It's also the place where web monitoring processing pulls the data, because we don't actually post the raw content to it when we ask for a diff. We say diff these 2 URLs, and in those URLs are URLs to items in S3.
Got it. Okay. Great. This is super helpful. Was there more comments on the scanner UI, to the WebMon UI? And if not, I mean, we can also take this offline too. But one quick question too is, are these sort of like, this is numbering system sort of with the letters making sense? Is this a useful way to describe the flow of how the pieces interact? If there are other ways that people have seen stuff describe these kinds of systems, please let me know. This was just a quick sketch after my conversation with Kevin.
I wasn't really looking at the numbers. The thing I would say maybe is that there's probably 2 independent simultaneous operations, so maybe they deserve separate numbering systems, which is things getting imported from other sources like Versionista or Internet Archive, and somebody using the UI and trying to do something.
Right.
So I'm not sure where 1 was because it's off screen now.
Yeah, so and maybe the numbering is actually confusing because it was like the letters are the steps, so I can think about that too. But it was like the idea was like 1A would be like grabbing the data from Versionista, the scraper, and then 1B would be, well, this is wrong, but 1B would be to like get it into S3. So I think some of this has to be rejiggered, but I appreciate the fact, Rob, that there are these 2 flows that we can describe as steps, and maybe I'll work on trying to make those more clear.
Okay, so the numbers are like overall they're indicating a given flow, and
Yes.
the ABC is the steps in the flow.
Right.
Okay.
You could even imagine having the same layout a couple different times, like make multiple diagrams.
Right. One for
And
each
then-
flow.
So
Yeah.
this is what happens when a job is scheduled. This is what happens when a job is processed. This is what happens when a user visits the site.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah. That thought occurred to me too, and maybe it'll be easier to simplify it.
So over on the UI side, is what you have is web monitoring UI there meant to indicate the back end of it, and that's why it's separated out from the other things all the way on the right hand side?
Yeah, I was imagining this to be actually like the web pages.
Okay.
Maybe that's not clear. And then this is like the code.
Cool. I think this is probably not 100% clear, but I got it because I understand the architecture of it.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are somewhat confused by that part, so it might not be totally obvious to somebody
Okay.
who's new to the system.
Right.
So you might need to call that out more explicitly.
Yep.
The other thing I would say is the web monitoring UI backend does not ever talk to web monitoring DB. Only the front end does.
Okay.
So the front end gets loaded from the web monitoring UI backend, and it communicates through the web monitoring UI backend to talk to the sheets. So that flow is correct. But when it wants to get data from the DB, it just talks directly to the DB, because DB is meant to be a public API for any sort of application to use to get data.
Okay. So what does the web monitoring UI backend talk to?
The only other service it talks to besides itself is Google Sheets.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
Just in case any of this has skipped over some details for Sarah, I know everyone's on the call, but just real quick. So web monitoring DB, to be super clear, is the Rails app that is on top of a database, but it's a confusing name. So that's the Rails app. That's the public API, and it manages it all everything we know about the data that we've collected. But we also have this other component where we're trying to assign volunteer human analysts subsets of pages to inspect. And right now, all of that configuration is stored in Google spreadsheets because it's just easy for people to deal with. So our UI is talking to the Rails app to get information about what snapshots we have saved. And Google Doc, when somebody says, okay, I'm ready to sit down to do my week's work, which pages am I supposed to check? That comes from the Google Docs. And then I guess the data that they generate goes to Google Docs. I don't even know that. Is that right? The annotation?
Yes, except that part of the UI is turned off right now, but yes.
Right. Okay.
It goes it goes to two places because we have two different workflows going on right now.
Yeah.
It goes both to Google Docs and to the database, because the database has a facility for storing and querying analysis that people generate. But right now, because the analysts have a workflow that's entirely based on Google Sheets, it also goes to Google Sheets so that we're trying to prevent having some kind of hard switch where you lose everything you had and you have to move over to this totally new system. And if it's not working, we're not working the way you need it to, then you have a huge problem. So we're trying to put it in both places so that as people start using the tool to do the annotations instead of hand editing the sheets, that it'll still be in the same place so they can use their existing workflow or continue to use their existing workflow for writing reports and doing all the things that come after that analysis, but they can then slowly transition to using the database because they can actually ask questions of the database and do queries and scope things rather than having a problem trying to do that in Sheets.
Yep.
Right. I mean, in theory, we could have arrows going into like the analyst sheets here, that these lines would be, human lines, not computers talking to. But that's interesting.
Wait, so what the analysts are doing today, just to be clear, is they click links into Google Sheets that go to specific UI endpoints. So they look at the comparison, and then they by hand write down, this is a significant change that we should send to the next level and write a report about, or this is not.
Yes.
And all of the app is eventually going to try and capture that, and we've sketched that out, but we've turned it off.
Yes.
Okay.
The other thing worth keeping in mind in here, and Dan got at this a little bit, is that I think a lot of people look at the architecture And their first thought is to see web monitoring DB as sort of the back end for UI, because most of what UI is doing is asking DB for information about pages, and asking DB for the diffs of pages. And most of what it does is talk to DB. And it's probably somewhat confusing that it also talks to UI in a couple weird circumstances. And it has to have these two separate things of like, which API am I asking for which stuff? And the reason that exists is because the initial ideas behind all of this was not to have a custom UI. It was to have a database that let you query the information from Versionista, because your ability to do that was extraordinarily limited, and then provide that querying tooling on top of which we could do automated analysis, and limit down what people had to actually look at. The whole role of all of that. And then the third thing was, hopefully someday that database could become public so that when we publish reports, we can point people to the raw data we're using as evidence. And so it was shaped around this idea of supporting querying and analysis, automated analysis, and supporting the idea of being a public database of changes and the things we know about those changes. And so it was not designed to be a backend for a user interface. We tacked on the user interface later as part of this idea that we could maybe provide better diffing tools, or maybe we just need to get entirely off of Versionista. And that has sat very uneasily with the idea that the database should be a public database. Because if it is, you probably don't want all the information about how an individual is tasked, like what pages they're responsible for looking at every day, or what the timeframes of those taskings are, whether right now they're week-long timeframes or 3-day-long timeframes or whatever, all of that kind of stuff. So that's why there's a separate system for that part, and why UI has its own backend for managing that part. Because in a really strict sense, that responsibility is part of the responsibility of the tool that helps analysts do their analysis job, as opposed to the tool that stores and queries data about all the pages. There's probably a reasonable question to ask, which is, should we find a way to merge those two things? But they're separate for that reason. And it's a little bit confusing. And yeah, I just want to point that out so that it's clear, because I think a lot of people get confused about it when they're new to the project and trying to understand it technically.
Yeah,
Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's a great example of something that we can document better in the repos on the setup.
Yeah.
So here, great. That was super helpful. I'll try to iterate on that too. There might be some questions. Probably even rewatch the video after it's uploaded. But I think this is a good start to making sure we have good documentation on how all the pieces fit. Any other quick questions or comments before we close up today? Sounds good. Sarah, thank you for sitting it out. I hope it was informative. I'm going to circle back with, pardon?
Oh no, I was just saying it wasn't. Thanks for having me.
Okay. No, we're excited to have you on board. I'll circle back with you to any questions. I saw that you joined Slack, which is great, and I can get you set up with an account too. But yeah, welcome.
Awesome, thanks.
Okay, great to see everyone. Have a good day.
Later, y'all.